Everyone. Thank you for attending. My name is John Grimm. I teach with Mary Evelyn Tucker, a joint master's degree program at Yale Forestry and Environmental Studies and Yale Divinity School. The plan for today's panel on the Papal Encyclical on the environment is to open with a perspective from Catholic theology and then a panel of interdisciplinary presenters whom I will briefly introduce, followed by a question and answer session and a final summary by Dean Sterling from Yale Divinity School. We are reminded in this room that science, law, ethics, and religion have been in productive dialogue in many settings, and this afternoon is one of them. That is because here, at the center of the beautiful Tiffany stained glass windows, science and religion are portrayed in relationship of mutual respect. This window is 125 years old. So it's interesting to think about the dialogue of religion and science when it was put together, and here we are carrying on that dialogue. Our dialogue then is aspirational as we develop a deepened understanding of our different subjects of study and research in relation to the encyclical. And it's appropriate to ask the question, what is an encyclical? It is the highest level of teaching document in the Catholic Church. This is the first encyclical on the environment and will be released this summer. Who helped Pope Francis I to write it? He received advice from scholars in the humanities, the social sciences, and especially the natural sciences. They met at the Pontifical Academy in May of last year, and also they drew extensively on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC report. Also, theologians and ethicists on the Pontifical Council on Justice and Peace and others around the world have advised the Pope. How will it be brought out? This document, when it comes out, will probably be about 50 pages long, but there will be a summary attached to it, so it will be released on the Vatican website with translations. Then through education, it will reach into universities, high schools, and seminaries, and then in churches from the pulpit, sermons, and it will certainly draw attention in religious education. The content of the encyclical, while it has not been released, there have been certain concepts that have been leaked. One of the major terms that will be used is integral ecology, the sense of attention to people and planet, bringing together in the concern for environmental degradation and climate justice, namely what's now being called eco-justice. So this encyclical will bridge social justice and eco-justice. The audience, 1.2 billion Catholics, obviously, but 2 billion Christians. The World Conference of Churches will certainly attend to it, and we'll talk about other religious traditions in the panel. Finally, what are some immediate and long-term objectives? Obviously, raising awareness and action with regard to environmental concern, and this will lead this Pope to attend to the United Nations General Assembly. He will address it later this year in September, and also a joint session of Congress. So all of this, Francis is very conscious as moving towards the December meetings of the climate discussion. So let's begin with Teresa Berger, Professor of Liturgical Studies and the Thomas Golden Professor of Catholic Theology at Yale Divinity School, who will make opening comments setting the encyclical in a Catholic theological context. Thank you, Teresa.
Thank you, John. I have 3.5 points, which is half a point more than Pope Francis usually has in his sermons. I begin with just a couple of words on the kind of text this is for people who are not used to reading and speaking Vaticanese. This will be an encyclical that is written in Vaticanese. The text right at the moment is, the dominant version will be Latin, but it will come out in other languages. These encyclicals in the last 100 years have ranged very broadly in topic, from issues related to problems of the day that the popes wanted to attend to, rights of workers, the dignity of women, to theological documents on the liturgy, on biblical interpretation, and so on and so forth. This will be the first encyclical on the environment, but it's by no means the first word the Catholic Church has spoken on the environment. That's important to remember. So I come with that to my second point. Pope Francis is drawing not only on work that has already been done by popes before him who have spoken on the environment, although not in encyclical form. He's drawing on other movements within the Catholic Church. There is a global Catholic climate movement, its specific name is that, and a lot of smaller groups. Many of the bishops' conferences, for example, around the world, from Australia to Canada to South Africa, have published texts on the environment. So whatever we think about the Pope publishing an encyclical, he's not the only Catholic speaking about environmental issues. He is, of course, the most visible one amongst Catholics speaking on this. Third, and for me as a Catholic theologian, this is the most important point. It doesn't take a prophet to tell you that this encyclical will embed environmental concerns in an overarching theological narrative. And probably what that narrative will be is a narrative that situates the universe within a notion of creation, that thinks about the universe as on a God-sustained journey, and looks at the universe having a telos, a point of fulfillment beyond earthly realities. Whatever we say, again, about this papal encyclical, I think we won't get to the heart of it without an acknowledgement of this theological narrative. Another little example, this Pope doesn't mince words. He will probably talk about the sin of exploiting the earth. Again, a very substantial theological category. In terms of authorities that will govern this encyclical, yes, there was broad consultation, but as Vatican-ES goes, this specific speech act, I think two of the authorities that I guarantee will be in there are the scriptures, the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament, and then the tradition of the Catholic Church. I would bet that there is a reference to one of the documents of Vatican II in there. So if you want to take me up on that bet, I think you will lose, but you're welcome to. Those are my 3 points. My half point with which I conclude is that I think the Pope will conclude the encyclical with a gesture of hope, which I think we all need at this point of the ecological crisis.
Thank you very much, Teresa. That's so helpful to have your overview. Let me introduce the panel in the order in which they will speak, and I will not refer to you again, so please just carry on. First, Peter Crane, Dean of Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies, will speak to the issues of the important dialogue of science and religion in relation to the encyclical. Margaret Farley, Gilbert Stark, Professor Emeritus of Christian Ethics at Yale Divinity School, will address the ethics of Catholic social teachings and ecology. Mary Evelyn Tucker, co-director of the Forum on Religion and Ecology at Yale, will offer some observations on how other religions may respond to the encyclical. Dakila Changyolpa, McCluskey Fellow at F&ES, will share her experience with Buddhist monks working on environmental issues and suggest ways that their work will be enhanced by the encyclical. Doug Kaiser, Joseph Field Professor of Law at Yale Law School, will make comments on how environmental law and policy might be affected by the encyclical. After the panel, then we will open to questions from the audience. Thank you, Peter.
So thank you, John. It's great that we have such a wonderful attendance here today, and I particularly want to thank Dean Sterling for his efforts for working with us to bring together our two schools to consider this important issue, and I hope that's the beginning of a longer and deeper relationship. We've only got a little bit of time, so I'm just going to kind of zip through the things that seemed important to me as I was thinking about this early this morning. So obviously one can interpret the significance of this encyclical at multiple levels. I'm just going to highlight three. First, I think as a catalyst in building appreciation of and willingness to deal with climate change at a global level. John's alluded to that to some degree. I'll say some more about it in a moment. Second, its role in continuing to build awareness of the strong linkages between environmental problems of all kinds, not just climate change, and fundamental issues of human well-being and justice. And third, its role in changing the debate around environmental concerns, including climate change, from a sole focus on science and technology and economics, which is where it's generally framed, to broader considerations of this issue in moral, ethical, and for some people, spiritual terms. So with regard to point one, the catalytic role, the timing, as you've already heard, of this encyclical is either the result of careful planning or a very happy accident. Because as you've heard, it will appear over the summer. As you've heard, in September, the Pope will speak at the UN in New York and to a joint session of Congress in DC, where, incidentally, there are 167 Catholics, more than any other denomination in the Congress. And crucially, this comes just 2 months before the Conference of the Parties to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change that will take place in Paris in early December. Now, since I arrived here at Yale in the summer of 2009, the first thing that was on my agenda was the Copenhagen Climate Summit in December 2009. And since then, which was a very difficult process, did not at all live up to what we all hoped it might, people have been working very, very hard to put the pieces together, to come to Paris, to conclude an agreement. And if you look at what's happened over the last 18 months, you'll see that the pieces have been steadily put in place. So this is not an encyclical that comes in isolation. It's part of a process that's been unfolding really since Copenhagen, before, indeed, all the way back to 1992. So it comes as an important moment, and it'll be an important part of the process that will create new impetus and a concerted push to reach a global agreement on climate change. Now, that's not going to solve all of the problems. There's much to be done at regional and local levels, but it's a very, very important kind of global statement. And Tony Lacerowitz in our school, who thinks about how the American public regard climate change, his work, recently published work, shows that this encyclical, at least with regard to climate change, will fall on fertile ground, because his work shows that a solid majority of Catholics, 70%, think that global warming is happening, and also that Catholics in the US are significantly more worried about global warming than other Christians. So now, with regard to point two, the connection to issues of social justice, the encyclical will re-emphasize that the world's most vulnerable people shoulder the greatest environmental burdens, and that it's the health and daily lives of the poor that are and will be most impacted by environmental degradation. The Pontifical Academy has already been referred to. Later this month, April 28th, there'll be a high-level meeting at the Vatican of Vatican officials, plus these external advisors from science, business, diplomatic corps, development, religious leaders, academicians, and so on, and the UN Secretary General. And to quote from the kind of preamble to that meeting, the aim will be to raise awareness and build consensus that the values of sustainable development cohere with the values of the leading religious traditions, with a special focus on the most vulnerable, to elevate the debate on the moral dimensions of protecting the environment in advance of the papal encyclical, and to help build a global movement across all religions for sustainable development and climate change through 2015 and beyond. So with regard to point three, changing the nature of the debate, Part of the outcome of that meeting that I mentioned, and again I'm quoting from the documents, a joint statement on the moral and religious imperative of sustainable development, highlighting the intrinsic connection between respect for the environment and respect for people, especially the poor, the excluded, children, and future generations. So as this indicates, the encyclical will give new prominence to the ethical and moral dimensions of environmental degradation, including climate change. And this will be, you could think of the climate negotiations themselves as being a kind of a short-term win, but the kind of longer-term win will be as these ideas become incorporated into Catholic teaching with its vast reach, but also as they seek, as that window does, to bridge the divide between science and religion. So speaking as a scientist, science and religion, in their own ways, both awaken a sense of awe and wonder at the complexity and beauty of life, and combined with the indisputable link between the health of people and communities and the health of the environment, the encyclical will emphasize the care and humility that's needed in our relationship to the natural world, and that has moral and ethical dimensions. A little under a year ago, the Pope made a short speech in which he emphasized, quote, the beauty of nature and the grandeur of the cosmos. He emphasized that that was a Christian value. As a scientist, I'd go further. I'd say it's a universal value, and it's a universal value that I think most scientists would subscribe to with enthusiasm.
I changed the title of the event slightly to read a letter from Pope Francis on climate and environment, why a papal encyclical may matter. We don't know yet that it really will. Something matters to us when it is important to our loves, our fears, our needs, our convictions, or even our puzzlements. Ordinarily, papal encyclicals offer teachings that are meant to be taken seriously by Roman Catholics, not necessarily as absolute doctrines, but as official articulations of religious and moral understandings. They aim to clarify religious beliefs and ethical issues, and to inspire those who read or hear about them. They may engender disagreements over some of their content, and they may illuminate change in church practice and belief, moving from earlier articulations to more adequate insights and imperatives. In response to the question, then, as to why a new encyclical on the environment might matter to Roman Catholics and even to a wider audience, the answer, as I see it, is not that suddenly every hearer will feel bound to act in accordance with what is said. It is rather that attention will be paid to what is offered. Dialogue will ensue. New insights may grow, and new experiences of moral claims regarding climate, environment, and crisis will awaken within us. Let me propose some examples of what may be included in such an encyclical that may make it matter significant for us. So first, the encyclical can offer what are new perspectives for many. Not all, and I suspect for most of you, these are not new. New perspectives for many on the relationship that ought to be between human persons and nature. From relations primarily of utility, domination, exploitation, nature-human relations may instead be based on the intrinsic value inherent in each and in all non-living, living, non-human, and human beings. Each has both instrumental and intrinsic value, created and held in being by God, beautiful in themselves with a telos and finality. Nature and humanity are not thereby wholly separated from one another, whether over against or in complementarity. Humanity is situated within nature, in a broader view of nature. The relationship is one of interdependence, participation, and for humans, the possibility of conscious love, gratitude, and awe. For Pope Francis, this yields in many of his even off-the-cuff speakings. For him, this yields a religious obligation to protect creation, to care about the work of God, to nurture rather than diminish the possibilities of both nature and humanity. A second example of an important perspective for inclusion in the encyclical, if it is to matter to many of us, is the development of skills and sensibilities for moral discernment. Resources for moral discernment and action are available in particular in the Roman Catholic tradition known as Catholic social teaching. From the late 19th century on, this tradition has been expanded and refined so that issues of justice, such as racism, economic inequities, just wages, rights of workers to organize, war and peace, nuclear disarmament, and so on, have been taken up by scholars as well as church leaders. Human and legal rights theories have been developed and applied in response to moral imperatives undergirded by principles such as respect for the dignity of every individual, concern for the common good, solidarity in and among communities, religious liberty, etc. With these have come ethical claims for justice and care, not only in one's own group, but in relation to all peoples, including future generations. These kinds of efforts have brought together issues in environmental ethics, linking, for example, negatively, economic exclusion and inequality with ecological devastation, linking positively care for all of creation and the principle of preferential option for the poor. This kind of analysis has been cited by Pope Francis on multiple occasions. Also, new understandings of natural law have allowed the questioning of rigid notions of eternal order and the importance not only of understanding human and non-human suffering, but the work of the sciences in the service of ecological restoration and protection. An encyclical that can touch the consciences of people on such issues will surely matter to the world of the present and the future. There are many other examples to be tapped in probing problems and perspectives that matter for those who may receive such an encyclical. Problems such as population growth in relation to the environment, and women's burdens which escalate with the devastation of sources for water and food, extreme poverty, and the circumscription of options for education. The encyclical, to be focused on climate and environment, could go a long way towards simply understanding and challenging these kinds of needs, and longer still toward remedying them. If it fails to do so, the crises before us may only increase. Perhaps either way, we shall learn more about what really matters in our lives and the world in which we live.
Thank you, fellow panelists. I'm going to speak just briefly at the beginning to say this encyclical will affect Christians around the world, as Tony Lasarowitz's polling has shown, and the Yale Project on Climate Communications has been essential. The Jesuits are going to take it into education. They have schools and universities around the world. The World Council of Churches is already moving forward on this. The Patriarch of the Greek Orthodox Church has been working for more than 15 years on these issues, is a good friend of the Pope. And as well, there's an evangelical environmental network here in the US. There's people here in the audience like Patrick and others, and Andrew, who are working on this issue. But I'm going to really address the question of what are other religions going to do with this encyclical? Now, clearly this is going to be somewhat speculative, but why will this encyclical reach out beyond the Christian world? There are more than 1 billion Muslims, 1 billion Hindus, 1 billion Confucians who will be hearing this call to action. And while it's difficult to predict their response, I'll offer a few general observations focused on Asia, where nearly 2/3 of the world's people live. This is an area that I've studied and traveled in for over 40 years, especially China, Japan, and India. The rapid changes I have seen during those 4 decades is why I am doing this work with John and many, many others in religion and ecology, so that the diverse environmental ethics of the world's religions will be part of the search for environmental solutions. As we know, people's cultural norms and religious values matter enormously in changing attitudes and behavior. Clearly, Asia is increasing in its importance for the future of the planet. With rapid industrialization in India and China, over 2 billion people in these countries are yearning for the fruits of modernization. But the cost has been immense in terms of pollution of air, water, soil, as well as loss of biodiversity. The health of both people and planet is being greatly stressed, and the ecosystems especially. A recent YouTube series called Under the Dome showed the dangerous levels of pollutions in Chinese cities. This was viewed by over 250 million people in China before it was shut down, but the mere fact that it was on says the government as well as local people know that they are up against some serious, serious problems. You can watch it here in the West, though. How to address these problems, then, is not easy. For more than 40 years, since the Stockholm Conference of 1972, environmental scientists and policymakers, lawyers and economists have been struggling with these competing issues of environmental protection and economic development, such as we see in Asia. As another approach, we have worked to include cultural and religious values as part of the solution to environmental problems. Over the last 20 years, the Forum on Religion and Ecology, with many people around the world, has been drawing together the research of scholars and theologians of the world's religions to identify theology, ethics, and practice regarding ecology and justice from these traditions in books, journals, and films. The Pope's encyclical, then, will help to awaken an even broader response among the religious traditions and build on the work that has been done. Let me suggest several ways that this will happen. As Peter mentioned, the Pope is convening in April, later in April, a conference of religious leaders at the Vatican to focus on climate change. The Secretary General of the UN will be there. But the Pope will urge these leaders to join him in speaking out on the human suffering that climate change is causing, especially for the poor. This will clearly encourage religious leaders to address these issues in the language of their own traditions, as the Karmapa did here yesterday at Yale in a magnificent talk on the values of Buddhism for conservation. 2,500 people were there listening to this talk. His influence, the Karmapa's influence, along with the Dalai Lama, extends to millions of people throughout the Himalaya region and well beyond. Dakila will be describing her work with the Karmapa to involve 50 monasteries in environmental protection. I could speak of other religious leaders in India as well. But the encyclical will spark even further exploration of the resources for environmental ethics in the traditions of India, Hinduism, Jainism, Buddhism, and of China, Confucianism, and Taoism. The Harvard books on these religious traditions and ecology that many of us have been involved in have been published in India and translated into Chinese. Conferences are now proliferating in China that are focused on this term ecological civilization, which the Chinese are trying to bring forth on a government level, on an academic level, and on a popular level, because they know they are up against these limits. And they're basing these on their ethical values of their traditions. So in addition, the fastest growing religion in China is actually Christianity. There are 100 million Christians in China, more than 85 million members of the Communist Party, which are considered atheists. So these Christian groups will certainly be influenced by the message of the encyclical, especially as they are living in regions adversely affected by environmental problems and climate change. The encyclical then will speak to leaders and laity in many religious traditions. It will deepen the moral awakening to ecology and justice as one issue, eco-justice. It will ignite a groundswell of concern for addressing these challenges in terms of both science and religion, ecology and ethics, as this panel illustrates. Let us hope that here at Yale, we will also respond to environment and climate change challenges, not just at the School of Forestry and Divinity, but with a broadened attention in our curricular choices and sustainability practices for preparing all of our students to contribute to a flourishing future. Thank you very much.
Good evening. Is this on? Good evening. Can you hear me okay? Thank you for having me here. I thought before I started talking about the work I've been doing with Tibetan Buddhist monasteries, I would do a small overview of how climate change is affecting the Himalayas. As many of you know, the Tibetan Plateau and the Himalayas are the main source for 7 great freshwater rivers in mainland Asia. And this includes everything from Indus to the Ganges, Brahmaputra. Speak louder. Indus, how about this? The Indus, the Ganges, the Brahmaputra, Salween, Mekong, Irrawaddy, and the Yellow and the Yangtze rivers. So the source of all of these rivers actually are in the Tibetan Plateau. And as you can imagine, as climate change starts to affect how water is stored in the Tibetan Plateau, it obviously is going to affect over 1 billion people easily in mainland Asia. One of the biggest challenges of climate change is that actually the impacts are being felt much more rapidly in the mountain areas than in the rest of the world, and certainly in the lowlands of India and Pakistan, Nepal, and Bhutan. So when we think about climate change there, what we're looking at is increasing temperature, glacial retreat, snowmelt, a lot more snowmelt, which is leading to glacial lake outbursts, and floods, and then in contrast, droughts. And it often happens within a 3-month gap that you're going to have floods in the beginning of a monsoon, and all of a sudden the monsoon tapers and you end up with a major drought. In terms of how communities are affected in the area, of course you have immediate disasters, and that's what most people think of when they think of impacts from climate change among people, right? So usually it is it's a lot of people that get displaced or that are actually injured, people that die, roads that are blocked off, and so on. But there's also a deeper problem that's going on, which is that of the loss of livelihoods and the changes in crop patterns. So we're also talking about mass hunger that's moving into the region, but people aren't able to identify that as a climate change problem or an impact that is happening because of climate change. And there is a third issue that comes in that governments seem to be becoming very aware of, but I would say society isn't picking up on, which is conflict. You know, before I created this program to work with religious leaders, I worked in the Mekong region. And the first time we had a climate change adaptation conference for the entire region in the Mekong, what was really surprising was that the governments were sending military advisors to these conferences, and that actually the governments were much more aware and were seeing climate change as a major cause for future conflict. We certainly see it already in the Himalayan region, you know, with a lot of refugees moving in from Bangladesh, and how that actually changes society and how that changes how communities access to natural resources. So these are some of the impacts that we are seeing in the Himalayas. I think some of the biggest challenges in terms of addressing such impacts include the lack of awareness, of course, and most of us probably deal with this at some level or the other. There is then the opposite problem, which is there is too much awareness. And so people are completely frozen. There is this state of paralysis. People don't know who should be responsible. There is a sense that it's somebody else more important, or you know, more civically engaged should actually be responsible for this problem. And I think what that leads to is a situation where the communities are incredibly disempowered. They understand that what they are seeing is caused by climate change. And unlike in the US or the UK or even Australia, in the Himalayas and in most places I've worked in around the world, people really believe that it is climate change that's causing these problems. So going back to this state of paralysis and this frustration, one of the biggest challenges we face is how do we make the communities empowered to become more resilient and to be able to adapt well to climate change. And in my case, because I began working for His Holiness the Karmapa, I hope some of you got to hear him speak yesterday, I began working with a group of monasteries in the Himalayas. And he actually had asked me to start training monks and nuns on environmental issues and start providing science training, basically, so they could understand what's going on in their communities. And what came out of it was an eco-monastic movement that's led by him. We have 55 monasteries that do environmental projects. And there are several kinds of project impacts that have come in the last 8 years. So of course you have their own footprint. So the immediate footprint that, you know, some of these monasteries have 5,000 monks and nuns in their community. So they buy from the local markets, they have trucks, they have cars and so on. They build buildings, massive concrete buildings sometimes. So they have their own footprint, and being able to change that footprint. There is the moral leadership that everybody has mentioned here, that they actually have this enormous sway in how communities see different issues and how they are, in some sense, triggered to think about issues and to feel about issues. I think another thing that I've noticed in terms of impacts by engaging them is that we see a ripple effect when they get involved in something. So an example I can give is that in Nepal, all the monasteries in Nepal actually picked climate change as their #1 issue, because Nepal is one of those places where, first of all, there's a lot of knowledge actually on the ground, but secondly, it's something that's very visibly felt. It's very visible to them, and they feel the impacts almost immediately. There have been a lot of glacial lake outbursts, a lot of flooding, a lot of drought in that area. The news often carries information including how wildlife is treated. There's a lot of information about how tigers are moving upland. You know, the tree line is shifting. And so generally speaking, in Nepal, there's a lot more awareness. All the monasteries chose to build solar and use solar. And there are, what I've noticed from, in terms of the project activities that work, is that it's the win-win, it's the combinations that work. So in Nepal, another big problem that you have, for those of you who might know it, is that there's a lot of load shedding. The power, usually you have it for maybe 4 or 5 hours, and that's the amount of electricity you're gonna get. And so for monasteries to pick solar, it really is a win-win for them. They have an independent source of energy, but they also know that they're doing what they can to address climate change. When these monasteries decided to do solar, they put it in the most visible places they could find. Often, you know, right where the Golden Dome is on top of a monastery, on top of the temple. And what we've seen is that actually there's almost a circle of effect. restaurants started putting, industry actually does a very visible environmental project, we see that the communities start adapting and picking it up very quickly. Another thing that they picked up was organic gardens. And again, it was a win-win. It was something that was healthy, that they knew affected their diet and made them more healthy. But at the same time, it also went back to this idea of being more resilient to climate change disasters. And again, we saw a growing impact in the community, and more communities started doing this. So having monasteries become engaged has definitely made a huge difference in terms of how I think the conservation community is also speaking about climate change and how they're adapting to it. But at the same time, the monks and nuns themselves have expressed many times that they feel really lost. And there is this moment where they are incredibly empowered and they feel like they're doing whatever it is they can. And then there is this pause when they say, but what comes next? And there is no global agreement. And they do actually track what's happening at a global level. This sort of frustration, what probably every one of us feels about Lima and so on. And so they go through that too. This is where I think the Papal Encyclical matters so much, because going back to what His Holiness said yesterday, there was a brilliant question from the audience about what do you do, when you feel frustrated and depressed and so on. And he said, you have to be part of a community because that's what sustains you. And I think what we're seeing incredibly, that's incredible right now is that religion's actually converging on this issue. It is a moment of convergence. It's not just one religious leader that's speaking up on it or that's been hammering at the door, talking about climate change. We're seeing a sort of chorus of voices coming around the world. And I know for the monks and nuns, we actually have talked about the Pope quite a bit and social justice, because eco-justice isn't how they see the world. And so for them to start putting these issues together and to recognize that other religious leaders and other religious communities are doing what they are doing as well, I think is actually ultimately the most empowering thing that can happen for them. So what I see as a sign of hope more than anything else is that there is such a movement working around the world, and it is not just a theoretical movement. As an activist, I must say that is the most positive thing I see. It is a very practical movement, that it's not simply the Pope is putting an encyclical and it's going to stop there. That actually churches are doing what they can to also change their own footprint. And the monasteries across the Himalayas and all the other religious institutions that are working on this around the world are actually changing their own footprint while trying to also get the rest of us to join them and see it as a moral obligation and right. Thank you.
Oh no, here comes the lawyer. Actually, throughout these remarks, I've been entranced by the image of a beautiful little knitted boot poking out from this infant car seat, being gently rocked by the gentleman in the front row. And I'm tempted to just scrap my remarks and have us all listen and watch for 5 minutes while the baby sleeps. But I won't. So despite efforts to manufacture doubt about climate science, responsible policymakers have actually accepted the seriousness of the problem for quite a long time. Indeed, in 1992, the nations of the world negotiated the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change that Dean Crane mentioned, known as the UNFCCC. And in that document, nations obliged themselves to adopt policies with the goal of, quote, preventing dangerous anthropogenic interference with Earth's climate system. Now, this obligation already exists as a matter of international law, but in the years since 1992, we've seen a steady rise in global greenhouse gas emissions, punctuated only by an occasional regional or global economic crisis, which seems to be the only thing that's capable of slowing the growth in emissions. So, why has the UNFCCC failed to generate meaningful climate action? It is not for lack of available policy tools. Indeed, despite efforts to manufacture doubt about the economic sensibility of adopting climate mitigation policies, we've known for a long time that a price on carbon is the simplest and most effective climate mitigation policy available to us.
Up a little more. We want to hear your every word.
Okay. So Just think, if the US Congress got its act together, we could reach 80% of our country's greenhouse gas emissions by regulating fewer than 3,000 entities through an upstream carbon tax. We could start collecting this tax tomorrow because the necessary entities are already subject to administrative tax collection regimes. And tomorrow, we could also start returning the economic value of that tax to individuals through a linked reduction in payroll taxes. The logic of this policy is so simple, a kindergartner could grasp it, but our Congress cannot. Tax bad things, not good things. Pollution is bad, employment is good, voila. So why have we failed to adopt this simple and obvious policy that would help to fulfill the urgent climate responsibilities that we have already acknowledged and accepted as a matter of international law? The answer is complex, and I can only offer here a very crude, digested version, but it goes like this. Because the global climate policy process has been held hostage by a country, this country, which has found its own political process held hostage by economic interests that are capable of investing not only in traditional capital, but also in the capture of laws and institutions that are intended to regulate capital, so that more and more of the rewards from human cooperation accrue in unequal proportions to a self-perpetuating and unaccountable elite. So, now I can answer the question posed to this panel of why the forthcoming encyclical is important. The encyclical is important because Pope Francis will not merely address climate change and humanity's obligation of planetary stewardship. He will address those issues within the context of what he calls an integral ecology that encompasses concerns of economic justice, true human development, and global solidarity. Pope Francis recognizes, as he said during his All Saints' Day homily last year, that, quote, we are capable of devastating the earth far better than the angels. And, he continued, this is exactly what we are doing. We destroy creation, we devastate lives, we devastate cultures, we devastate values, we ravage hope. He also recognizes, as he told the World Meeting of Popular Movements, that an economic system centered on the god of money needs to plunder nature to sustain the frenetic rhythm of consumption that is inherent to it. And finally, as he told delegates to the UNFCCC last year, Pope Francis recognizes that the effective struggle against global warming will only be possible with a responsible collective answer that goes beyond particular interest and behavior and is developed free of political and economic pressures. Climate change may be the most pressing, most wicked environmental problem facing humankind, but it may also be our best opportunity to address underlying economic, political, and cultural diseases that give climate change its appearance of inevitability. The encyclical will help to diagnose and minister to those underlying pathologies, so that if we do indeed heal the planet, we may also have a humanity worthy of inheriting it. Thank you.
We now have the happy occasion to have some exchange with the panel members. Teresa, may I ask you to take my place here to join us? And I'd like to ask you to come forward to the microphones because we are streaming this event. So please take the opportunity to move towards the microphones. And just a final reminder, let's frame a question rather than make a lengthy comment. Please, thanks.
Thank you, John. And thank you all for organizing this discussion. A lot of people are having talks about what to do after the encyclical comes out, so it's nice, although not surprising, that you all would do something before it comes out. It's very nice. My question is, and I think Margaret had talked about reframing the question. I would reframe it to, how do we ensure that the encyclical matters? And how do we ensure that it matters not to theologians, with all due respect to all of you folks up in the panel, but to common everyday people? How do we ensure that it matters in such a way that people are called to action, move to change, and move to get out of the pews and out to the streets?
Thanks, Andy. Is there a ready taker, or shall we have another question?
Maybe two questions.
Good. Let's do that, please.
What are the chances, do you think, that the namesake of St. Francis is going to issue a universal call for vegetarianism? And if not, why not?
Shall we draw some thoughts? Please do. Speak up, panel members.
Well, we had a call for vegetarianism last night from the Karmapa. Many of us have been vegetarian for a long, long time. It is one thing one can do. But I think, to Patrick's question, I think it's inevitable that this will trickle down, if you will, but also trickle up. I was at a conference at the Jesuit University Loyola in Chicago just 2 weeks ago. The Jesuits have the largest private education system in the world. There's 230 colleges and universities, and there's 2,500 high schools. And they are going to take this, they already are, into a curriculum that has science and values put together with an online textbook. They are also having Jesuits and scientists meet at the Stockholm Resilience Center in Sweden and take those conferences to every continent to rev up this sense that the science is here, the moral moment is also here. I think it's very hopeful.
Thank you. James.
Tequila, I was struck by the ripple effect of these monasteries working together. And I think institutionally, both the academic institutions like Yale and also faith-based institutions, what are the things that work well for getting institutional power motivated towards that ripple effect, or really with leadership and with buy-in from those communities?
Wow, that's a big question. Well, you know, when I created this program, I was with the World Wildlife Fund, and it was an unexpected moment for me. I was just a field conservationist that suddenly learned that actually working with religious leaders meant two things. One was that, yes, you changed and you decided to pick up different environmental values and behavior, but that you also felt like you were a better religious person. And because it happened personally, I found that I could actually convince other people. So I think what was the big lesson learned for me, creating this program at WWF and getting buy-in in a very science-based institution, was that actually it was the experience and the emotions that changed other people's minds. It wasn't the science. Despite what most scientists think, it wasn't the data that actually changed people's minds. But I think that's what we fall back on. I think that's what we trust and rely on. And I think it has a lot to do with our own identity and what we value, that we sort of fall back on that to convince other people and institutions. And this is where religious leadership is so crucial, of course, because they know exactly what it is that makes humans tick. And they know way better than us scientists or maybe even lawyers how that works. So I think there has to be a space for that and for a discussion around how we feel, what actually motivates us to do good things, just generally speaking, and what is it that we're concerned about in terms of how climate change is affecting us and what we need to do. And this is where the Pope matters so much.
Thank you, Tequila. Let's take two questions from this side. Yes.
I'm going to be a bit of a wet blanket here. Why should we believe that this encyclical will have an impact when the Church's teaching on contraception hasn't? You can make the argument regardless of whether whether the Church's teaching is sound or not. It's been consistent and insistent. It has had no impact on behavior of Catholics, at least in North America and Europe. Why should we be optimistic that there will be an impact of this encyclical?
Thank you.
Can I respond
Please
directly
do.
to that? Is it on? Yeah. Okay. Only because I actually started jotting down some ideas responding to the question of impact that I think will be relevant here. The first one is simply that I think we will be benefiting from the Francis effect. If this encyclical had been published by Benedict XVI, I guarantee that it would not have received half as much attention as this encyclical will. The second point, why its impact, I think, will be significantly larger than that of previous recent encyclicals, has to do with social media. Their power is increasing, and I think the Pope will harness that. The Vatican actually has a quite media-savvy presence in cyberspace. There was a third reason, and I'm blanking on it, so.
We'll come back to you. Professor Farley.
Well, just quickly, too, there are lots of reasons, but I have long thought that in the psyche of Roman Catholics, there is the need for things to make sense. And the encyclical on contraception has not made sense.
Because you're clapping so vigorously, why don't you take the next question?
Can't imagine a Catholic woman would clap so vigorously on that. Hi, my name's Nicole Perone. I'm at the Divinity School. This was great. I was wondering, for a lot of us in the room, we are involved on a more grassroots level with some of the things that are happening, especially in the Roman Catholic Church, and I'm wondering what suggestions the panel might make for us to take and roll with this encyclical. I know the U.S. bishops will be rolling out a lot of resources this summer, but what can a parish do, or theoretically a campus ministry do to actually have an impact?
That's a great question. Let's think for a moment, and let's have another question also, please.
Thank you for your comments. My question is, a growing number of scientists are now saying that the UN's global warming target of 2 degrees Celsius is too high to prevent catastrophic impacts. And last December, a group of Catholic bishops internationally demanded a limit of 1.5 degrees, which would require an even more dramatic break from economic orthodoxy. My question is there any prospect of the Pope himself endorsing such a more ambitious target in his encyclical?
I wanted to just speak to the first one. It's very doubtful that the Pope will make a prediction on what percentage, I think, right, Peter? But I think already there are many Catholic and broader Christian groups working on this issue, as you well know, and many of them are identified on the Forum on Religion and Ecology website. I would just refer you to Interfaith Power and Light, which is in 40 states already, working on carbon footprint with not only Christian groups, but Jewish groups, Islamic groups, and others across the country, about to meet in May. They're very catalyst that others have referred to. Thank you.
On the issue of, are the targets right? I think Mary Evelyn's right. I mean, I'm sure the Pope will not go into the kind of details of the UNFCCC. But I think more broadly, we should be very careful about being overly pessimistic. We should be very careful that the perfect is not the enemy of the good here. We've been working on this since 1992. We haven't managed to get it done. If we get something done in Paris, that's a cause for celebration. But I think what the encyclical is part of a kind of an alternate route, in a sense. It's a kind of an end run around the paralysis that Doug described. And we don't know whether that end run will work, but it certainly will create a new dynamic, I think, in combination with what's being said by other religious leaders.
We're approaching Dean Sterling's.
I'm intrigued by Peter's comment about how many Catholics there are in the Congress. And if you take that and compare it to the final comments about how we've had no chance at all for an effective climate policy, and how, Margaret Farley's talk about the social justice aspect of, and how hugely important this is, I'm wondering if there's, how can we imagine the right kind of conversation in the Congress and with the Catholic community in the United States about the fact that this is not only about us, right, and that it's also about social justice, which is so central to Catholicism.
Thank you. Please.
Hi, and thanks everyone for your comments. It's been great. My question kind of goes to what you were saying, Tequila, around messaging and almost an overburdening of negative information and just kind of nihilism and defeatism around this. And thinking particularly then around young people and a lack of religious belief. How do we pivot these sort of conversations to combat some of the nihilism that does exist around climate change, and how do we pivot towards hope and opportunity rather than large-scale pessimism and defeatism? Thank you.
Thank you. Good. Related questions. Please, would you?
a twist on the contraception question, if I may. We know that overpopulation is one of the greatest causes of environmental degradation. And we know that in the poorest parts of our country, our world, like sub-Saharan Africa, women are having an average of 7 children. Now, there is population decline in wealthier and European countries, it's true. But we know the Pope has been very clear he's not going to change the doctrine on contraception. Why should we take what he has to say seriously on overpopulation then? And how do you think he might work around?
Good. Thank you. Thank you. May I? Thanks, Doug.
I'd like to make an observation about this conversation that speaks to the question of pessimism and nihilism versus hope. From the climate science perspective, we now have a concentration level of carbon dioxide that the Earth has not seen in 800,000 years. And our models tell us that even if we stopped emitting all greenhouse gases tomorrow, it would be well over 1,000 years before we get back to the level of concentrations we had before industrializations. So from a lawyer's perspective, this is a problem that has a time horizon that's simply unfathomable. I mean, in the US, 2 years is our time of policy horizon because that's the re-election cycle in the House of Representatives. So when Dean Crane said that one could imagine action, both the scientists in the room and those from a religious position in the room are imagining a much, much, much longer horizon of meaning than us lawyers ever could conceive of. And I think that's a wonderful synchronicity between the two dialogues.
Professor Farley?
Well, I could just say I've been reading a fair amount of what Pope Francis has been saying especially in the Philippines, but in other places as well, about controlling birth. And even though he has certainly not gone to the point of saying all forms of contraception are good, he certainly has been very clear that there is no obligation to keep having children after a point where one cannot responsibly care for them, et cetera, and that it may be even a moral failure if they are not encouraged to, the Catholic term, responsible family planning. So I actually have become a little hopeful about that he's reasonable on what the consequences are, good or bad. And I think that with his own, when you work on something yourself, you get to kind of believe in it too. So the whole process of producing this encyclical may in fact also change his minds on some things, just as we change our minds on some things when we work through things further and further. So I'm totally pessimistic. I'm less pessimistic than I ever. Okay. I'm less pessimistic than I have been for many, many years.
Two brief remarks by panelists, please, Mary Evelyn and Tequila.
Do you want to go? I think this hope and pessimism question is quite huge, and I'm glad to hear Margaret's hope. I just wanted to put into the mix that our Quaker friends are here. Civil rights and abolition were changed by the religious communities, the Quakers in England and the religious communities here in the US. I'm a 60s person. It was a transformative moment. This is the moment for environmental issues to come together with those justice issues. But I would also say we haven't held up another huge change agent, and that is certainly what Bill McKibben has done with 350.org against all odds, has created a worldwide movement. And Bill has been a great ally in this work with religions and ecology, absolutely a partner for 15 years on this. And I would suggest that the movement that he's promoting at the moment on divestment is absolutely central. The World Council of Churches has gone to divestment. The UCC churches have gone to divestment. The Anglican Church is thinking about it. The Episcopal Church in this country has $2 billion in pension funds. They're considering this. These are agents of change. So there's a range of them. And I would just say that the philanthropy community, including the Rockefeller brothers who divested, and that was an amazing moment after the climate change march, where incidentally, among 400,000 people, there were 10,000 people from the religious communities. But my understanding is that people within the philanthropy communities are very keenly interested in figuring out ways to engage the religious communities, and I think this is very, very hopeful as well.
Thank you. Tequila?
So going back to this, the trying to pivot towards hope, actually there's so much to be learned from the Catholic Church about this. I was part of this event, the World Youth Day. I don't know how many of you know about it, but it's the largest pilgrimage event that happens on the world. And it's basically a week when the Pope directly connects with youth, Catholic youth. Most of them are, teenagers between the ages of 13 and 20, let's say 20, 25, it sort of stretches, I noticed, but usually it's people who are teenagers that come. And going back to this sense of euphoria, the uplifting that you experience when you are first actually coming to terms with your spiritual identity, you basically watch this unfold. And you're watching parents who are shoving their kids out there to go be part of this spiritual experience, right? And to me, what I learned watching that was that I had to go back to my hippie roots watching all of this happen, because there's a lot of mud and a lot of hysteria and a lot of endorphins and all of that going on. But it was this moment of realizing that actually this is why movements matter. This is why being part of a community matters so much, because we actually are taking on a collective identity that is way greater than our own personal one. And that when that is, the collective identity is a positive one and is a one geared towards moving and creating change in our societies, it naturally is an uplifting experience. So I think if we are actually helping make that happen or leading towards that kind of change, we are naturally working towards hope.
With the panel's permission, I'd like to invite Dean Greg Sterling of Yale Divinity School to make summary remarks.
Knowing that I stand between you and a glass of wine, I make the same promise Henry VIII made to his wives. I won't keep you long. I find it absolutely heartwarming to see this audience filled at the prospect. This is an audience of faith, obviously, because this document is not yet a reality. But that we are all here to think about the significance of this statement. And I'm going to just try to summarize what I consider the highlights of what's been said to make us remember, I hope, why it will be important to read this document. Let me begin with demographics. 16% of the world's population are Catholics. That is larger than the number of Hindus, it is larger than the number of Buddhists, and it is larger than any other single religion other than the Muslims or the faith of Islam. Catholics are half of the Christians in our world. So whatever one thinks, there are going to be a lot of people in this world who read this document because it will come from the head. 24% of the U.S. population is Roman Catholic. Secondly, Peter made the point that the timing of this is absolutely crucial because it is set to build towards and to give impetus towards the discussions that will take place in Paris next December, this coming December. And I think that this should help give some momentum in that direction. Something that has not been said, which I think should be said, is in my mind, there are two people in our world who have real moral authority universally. One is the Dalai Lama, and the other is the Pope. I mean, people who, when they speak, regardless of whether you're a person of faith or completely secular, we actually take notice of what these people said, whether it's the Dalai Lama telling the Chinese government that he will not be reincarnated, or whether it's the Pope making a statement on the environment. We listen because they have a moral standing that is unique. I hope, and this is a hope, that the comments that Mary Evelyn and that Takita have made will become a reality, that the document and all of the discussions will serve both as catalyst for others to make their voices more prominent and to build a chorus of voices of people who are already expressing those, but will give them an international platform that they may lack in a local context. And the last thing that I want to say is, if I were to put it crudely, it's the right thing to do. And what I mean by that, in a more sophisticated way, is what Margaret and Teresa have said about theological narratives, or about nurturing rather than diminishing the relationship between nature and humanity. It is the realization that as human beings, we are part of this world, and it's a way of moving this discussion, not that it's not taken place, but of giving a prominence to the discussion in a religious framework that it has not had before. There will be people who are Christians who will oppose what is said in this document, I'm sure. But they will no longer be able to respond simply on pseudo-scientific grounds. They will now have to respond on religious/moral/theological grounds. And I think that's healthy. So the takeaway that I have from this is, looking at the amount of interest here, coming back to John's opening point, this is an opportunity for those coming at this from a scientific perspective, those of us who think of it from a theological framework, to join forces to make sure that what happened in 1992 and has basically sat on the table doesn't happen again in 2015, but that there is real action and real movement in what takes place. And this audience gives me hope that that will actually take place. Thank you very much.
I'm glad you asked me.
Please join us for a reception in this space right off to my left, your right. Thank you again for coming.